Hello everyone, welcome to my video on understanding Logic Apps Preview. My name is Srikanth Machiraju. I'm an architect at Microsoft. I'm also a published author. I published books related to containers, Node.js, and bots. I'm also a ML, AI and ML professional, specialized in deep learning techniques. Today we're going to learn about Logic Apps Preview Runtime, which was announced pretty recently by Microsoft and it's currently in public preview. This video is accompanied by an article where I explain what has changed and what's new with the Logic Apps Preview Runtime. I recommend you to read the article before watching this video. This video is primarily focused on how do you develop, debug Logic apps on your from your local machine and deploy to Azure. And you'll also see how do you package the Logic app as a Dockerized as a Docker image so that it becomes more portable and you can deploy it on any Dockerized and Docker enabled platforms like Azure Container Instances, Kubernetes, Service Fabric, App Services, or any other platform which supports Docker today. There are a few things that you need to have on your machine to do this demo. The first one is, of course, Visual Studio Code with the latest updates. You would need an Azure subscription if you want to understand how to deploy Logic Apps on Azure, Logic Apps Preview on Azure. You can get a free one for 30 days. The third thing that you need on your machine is a tool which can be helpful for making HTTP requests, like a Postman or curl, or it could be anything. The fourth is an extension that comes for Visual Studio Code. It's called Logic Apps Preview extension, and I'll show you in a minute how that extension looks like. So once you have these four, you can pretty much do what I'm going to demo today, right? So the first thing is the extension. So when you have the logic, when you install Visual Studio Code and have all the updates installed, you search for Logic App Preview. This is the extension that I was talking about. So you need to install this extension. Once the extension is installed, the VS Code will ask you to restart, reload the instance. Once you reload, you will find in the Azure Explorer. So this is the Azure Explorer extension, and you will find a place where you can see the Logic App Preview Explorer. Right. So this means that you have successfully set up your VS Code for Logic Apps Preview development. So the way you get started after you have these two done is you click on this folder and say create new project. You can give your project any name. Let's say Fabricam Logic App. What happened? Okay, let me select some folder. Okay, you select some folder and then you choose between stateful or stateless workflows. If you want to understand what stateful and stateless workflows are, read my article related to this topic. So let's say you select stateful workflow, you need to give a name to that workflow, which is, let's say, my stateful workflow. Right, so this is the last step. Once you finish this step, you would end up with a project which should look very similar to this. So let's quickly go through some of the key files. So you have so this is there'll be a folder created with the name of the workflow that you have just entered. So if you give the name of the workflow as Contoso Logic App, there'll be a folder created called Contoso Logic App, within which you will find a file called workflow.json. So this is your workflow file in the JSON format. You'll also find a workflow design type, which contains a host.json and local settings.json. In the local settings.json, you have settings that will be used when you run the workflow logic app workflow on your local machine. Two things. The one thing which is important, very important here, is the Azure Web App Storage. You can, for local development, you can use the Storage Explorer, storage emulator. Um, but when you're deploying on Azure, you would need a storage account. So for to make the demo simple, I'm using an Azure storage account which I pre-created before, uh, which I already pre-created. So the second file is the host.json file. So if you're already familiar with working with Azure Functions runtime, you should be aware of what host.json file is. So it is the configuration file for the Azure Functions host. So you this is very minimal, but you have a lot of options that you can tweak with on the host.json file. In addition to this, this is an initial file that you have to create at this point only because Azure Functions runtime doesn't work. Sorry, Azure Logic Apps Preview runtime doesn't work with 5.0 .NET Core. So what we're doing here is pinning to some version lesser than 5.0. Here I'm pinning to 3.1.408, which is the version which I have on my machine. But you can pin to any other .NET Core runtime, which is SDK, which is basically lesser than 5.0. So there is a host.json file and local settings file at the global level as well. Since a project can have multiple workflows, there are workflow specific configuration and there's a host configuration. So these are the two different levels of files that you have in VS Code. So this is the whole setup of your project. We'll come back to the Docker file a little later. Uh, so let's first look at the Logic app itself. So the way you look at the Logic app is you have to right click the workflow.json file and say open in designer. It's going to take some time, but it's going to load a designer view of the JSON file. This is very similar to what you see on Azure portal today. So this is a sample logic app that I created. So basically, when a HTTP request is made to this workflow, I check a condition. The condition says like if there is a header with the name token, uh, then send a successful response with hello world in the body, 200 response with hello world in the body. And if the header is not present, consider it as unauthorized and send 401 with unauthorized in the body. So this is a simple logic app that I created. You can extend this to with few more steps. Like you can invoke an Azure function, or you can email the HTTP request body to your email account. So whatever functionality is currently existing on Azure, most of that is available. Additionally, you also have, if you have worked with Logic Apps earlier, there's something called as connectors, which can be used to work with different resources within the Logic app. So the Azure Logic Apps Preview gives you an ability to build your own custom connectors. Okay, we're not going to go into that, but it's just a fantastic feature that is available with Logic Apps Preview today. So once you developed your Logic apps, obviously you want to test it. So the way you should be able to run this is just by clicking on start debugging, or just hit F5. The moment you hit F5, you will see that it starts a Azure Functions runtime host. Because if you have already read my article, the fundamental change is that the Logic Apps Preview runs on Azure Functions runtime, right? So this is the function on Azure Functions runtime which has started. Now we need to invoke the workflow, right? So in order to invoke the workflow, the URL for the trigger is basically fetched by clicking on the overview button. So once you click on overview, it opens a dashboard very similar to this. So this dashboard gives you the callback URL. So this is the URL that will invoke our workflow. So you just copy this URL, go to any of the tools which can from where you can make a HTTP request, and paste. So within this, if you see, there are some things that are of importance. The first one is that the name of the workflow goes here, and the name of the trigger goes here. In my case, it's manual, but it could be any trigger. The name of the trigger should go here. API version is something which you should be aware. The important thing is the signature, which is the authentication to the function's host. In this case, the signature is auto-generated by the SDK itself. So you now with this particular URL, if you make a request with, of course, the logic with the header called token, because that's an internal logic to my Logic app, you should get a response saying hello world, right? So there's the hello world. If you similarly, if you remove the token and make a request, you should get a unauthorized response, right? So we were able to successfully invoke our Logic app, which is running on our local machine. And now, if you want to know what actually happened, for instance, this is a simple Logic app, but for complex Logic apps, you want to see what happened for any given instance. So you can refresh the Logic app whenever instances are created. You go to the one which you want to see and say click on show run, and you'll see that it will show you what happened for that particular run. So you got a request where the condition uh, failed, and then the response 401 unauthorized was sent. Right? Very similar experience that you get from Azure portal today. Now, the second thing which I wanted to show you is how do you deploy this, right? So once the function app is developed, tested locally, and you can also see the trace logs coming here nicely. What you need to do is you need to click on this button which says deploy to Logic app, right? When you click this, when you click this, you will be asked to create a Logic app if it doesn't exist. So let's say, let me assume that it doesn't exist and create a Logic app called Fabricam Logic app, right? And then click enter. You need to select an app service plan. So this is something new again. You need to select an app service plan very similar to an app service. The app service plan you select comes with predefined set of RAM and storage. So you need to choose as per your the computing and memory needs of your Logic app. So it's showing something which I already have, or you can create an app service plan. And then you choose the resource group where you want to place this. So this is the last step in the deployment. What I'm going to do is because the creation of the resources is going to take time, I already created the resources. So I'm going to deploy to the existing Logic Apps Preview account. Let me just close this. It's saying that you already have a deployment you want to do. There's no provision to undo today. I'm fine with that. Just click deploy. I'm going to stop the running instance. In the output window, you see that the deployment has started. It's going to take roughly a minute to deploy this. So the deployment is successful. We'll wait for Visual Studio Code to confirm that. So it's saying the deployment is completed. The next thing that you would want to know is how do you invoke the Logic app that's now deployed to Azure, right? So very similar to what we did on VS Code. In VS Code, if you remember, we went to the file here and clicked on Overview. For the instances that are running on Azure, you'll have to go to the Explorer, choose the workflow from here, and then click on Overview. You could also open the designer and start editing. Uh, so this is the URL that you should use to invoke the workflow which is running on Azure. So here I'm going to paste that URL. Things are very similar. This just the URL has changed, and and the port is now 443. So you get hello world. So the next interesting part is how do you Dockerize the Logic app. So if you've read my article, the key thing that has changed with the Logic app preview is that now the runtime itself is portable. So you can keep your workflow and runtime together and ship it, right? So that makes paths to Dockerize your Logic apps. So for Dockerizing a Logic app, basically you need an image. Microsoft has already has pre-created an image. So this is the image that we're going to use to create a Docker image which will contain our logic app plus the runtime. The another most important thing is if you remember the local settings file, if you see the local settings file, we're dependent on a storage account, Azure storage account. So this configuration is also needed for the image. So the environment variable Azure Web Job Storage should be fed with a Azure Storage connection string. This is very important, and you need to remember this connection string. I'll tell you why in some time. So you set up the environment variables along with the storage connection string, and you have the Docker file ready. So let's just create a container. Let's just build the image. Let me open a new terminal. So I have the commands here. So I'm going to create a image by the name Logic Apps Preview. This one is my Docker handle. So if you're doing it for first time, it's going to take some time for downloading the layers. These layers already exist on my machine, so it is a little fast. So now that the image is created, if you see the size of the image is around 1.2 GB. That's the reason it's going to take some time when you do it for the first time. This is the image just got created. Now what we'll do is we'll create a container. So I'm going to create a container where and with an environment variable name called website host and port as 8080 and the image name that we just created. So this is going to create a container instance of the image. It's going to take some time to load the function host, and slowly it should start spitting out the Azure function log to this terminal. Right, so the it started warming up. So the function app host is ready. So your Docker container is up and running. Now the key thing here is in order to connect to the Logic App instance, we use the workflow file for local, and we use the Explorer for when we deploy to Azure. When we deploy to the Azure, right? But now our Logic App is running inside a container. So how do you connect to that? How do you get the URL? How do you invoke the Logic App? So it's a two-step process. The first step is there is a predefined URL that is available on the runtime on the Logic App, which you have to invoke in order to get the callback URL. So this callback URL that you received from the that the portal gave you earlier, right? If you look at this callback URL, let me just point to that. So this callback URL is directly available from the tools here. But for the Docker container, you need to take one more additional step. You need to make a call to a predefined URL, and then you get a callback URL, which you will use basically to trigger the workflow, right? So the key thing is how do you what is that request? So if you notice this particular request, this is the predefined route. So this is where the container is running. Runtime webhooks workflow API management workflows is going to be same for every container that hosts a Logic App preview. What changes is the name of the workflow, which is going to be specific for the uh, Logic App that you're creating, and the name of the trigger. And from here again, it's the same API URL, API version is going to be same. So this is the URL you need to construct. The key thing here for after you build this is to get the authentication key. So where do you get this authentication key from, right? So the authentication key is inside the storage account that we have used to create the image. So in the image, so if you look at the image, there is a storage account here called Contours or Logic App. So inside this, there is a key. So you need to connect to the storage account. So I'm going to open Storage Explorer and I've connected to the storage account. So there are some random IDs here. One of these is our container which is running. It's very tricky to find out which one, but let's try based on the timestamp. So this is created 10:07 p.m. It should be the latest. Right, so this is the latest. And let's see the C. Yeah, right. So the one which we opened first is has the most latest timestamp. So let's open this host.json file. I'm going to download this. Selecting a local folder. So there's a file with the same name. I'm going to override that. Go to the folder. Let me open that in a notepad. So this key, the master key, is the code to connect to the container which is hosting your Logic app. So let me repeat the whole step once again. So we built a Docker image. The image is built using a storage account, and then we created a container of using that image. In order to invoke the Logic app within the container, you need a callback URL. In order to invoke that URL which gives you the callback URL, you need a key. That key is present in the image in the storage account that we used in the image. So you got the key. Now we invoke this um, code, invoke this URL. So this will give you the callback. So this is your callback URL that if you just call this, it's going to invoke the Logic app. So I'm going to take this, put it in a new window, and there are two things that you need to change here. One is the protocol because we're not hosting it on HTTPS, and the port is 8080. So this is the URL for invoking the Logic app, which is inside the container. Again, the other things the same. You have the token, which should give you hello world as a response, right? And just so that you know, it's working completely fine with the other negative test case. So it's if you don't have a token, it will give you unauthorized. So you have so now we have a Docker image inside which there's a Logic app. You can of course host this. You can push this to your Docker Hub or Azure Container Registry and deploy it anywhere on any Dockerize platform. So that's all I wanted to show in this video. Thanks for watching. Happy coding.